Hi, I'm Tami Walker, Mayor of Boxy, Queensland. Thank you for joining me today as I show you how I make my abandoned house diorama for my die-cast model cars. I start out with a chunk of foam 2 inches thick. I cut into 12-inch by 10-inch size pieces for my diorama sets, and I'm using balsa wood to make my buildings. There's a lot of people use some other different materials, but I've just loved to use the balsa wood. It seems to work really well for me. It's super easy to cut, and I've cut out all the windows and I paint around those first before I paint the rest of the building because the balsa wood will warp. I'm using clear packaging for my windows, and you can kind of see there 2 tiny little pieces that I cut out to maybe represent a broken window. And I've also pre-painted in my creek just some gesso and some black just for a filler, and I've got my house painted and it's slowly going on. This is where I've cut out the side for my LED and put a hole up through the bottom of the building, and there's my wire structure. It's a little green light. You can barely see it there at the top of the page there, and it's going to be my ghost in the house, and that's the little switch for it. I've painted all that Bambi brown, and I've got some dirt all drying on the side there, and I'm going to screen out some fine particles of that. I'm working on my garage, and I will be putting that in crooked, and I also changed the type of car I'm going to use, something a little bit more suitable to the 1/60th scale that I'm using. I've got the roof on, I've got the light inside. You can see that tiny little green glow. Just wanted a tiny little effect of it. Didn't need much. For my light switch, I made a little balsa wood box, and we'll hide the switch in there, but I also want to keep the cord long in case I need to reposition the wires for when I add them together with the other dioramas. Here, I'm just going to put my Mod Podge mat down, and just starting in small spots and slowly working and dumping that screened out dirt on. It's still got a couple big pieces in there. It's not a big deal. It'll brush off, or I can just glue them on. But I usually like to press it down to make sure it's nice and solid in there. Now, I haven't glued my house down yet. I like to just set the house where I want it and paint the Mod Podge all around the house where the dirt's going to be. If there's any empty spaces later on after I glue the house down, I can go ahead and fill that with dirt and other materials as I go. So I'm just dumping more of that dirt right on there, right over top of the glue. And my favorite part here is just dumping it all off and pouring that back to the container, but shaking all that excess stuff off. I'm going to spray it now with isopropyl alcohol or rubbing alcohol, and that just breaks the surface tension, so when I go ahead and put the glue down, it absorbs right into the dirt instead of just sitting on top of the surface. And I used to have a sprayer, but it always kept getting clogged, so I'm using this little eyedropper, which seems to work out pretty well. I still haven't perfected my mix of glue and water, but I'm doing okay, I think. I like to glue little grid patterns so it makes it easy just to do instead of just conquering a large section at once. It's much easier. This is the second time I'm using this program to make these videos with my microphone. I really hope everything works out well this time. I noticed after I uploaded my last video, the last 5 seconds, my sound was off of the picture, and I just couldn't figure out how that happened. But just try and try, right? So here I've got all the glue down, and I'm just going to sprinkle more dirt on top of that just to absorb the excess glue. And I mean, you can use a paper towel too, but this really actually looks a lot finer and a lot better to me just to sprinkle more glue right, or more dirt right on top of the glue. Much easier to do. So I got my bridge in, I got a little bit of gravel in, and I'm going to let that dry for a while. I've got a pop can that I just scuffed up all over and cut into little pieces. I'm putting some tape upside down right now just so I can hold my building into the frame, and you can see it'll just sit right there. And I cut out all my little pieces into rectangles and different sizes, and I'm just going to variously glue them to the top here. And I also sanded them too on both sides so that they'll stick easier and hold the dirt or whatever I decide to put on top of them later on. This is the first time I've made this style of roof. Usually I just leave the balsa wood plain and paint it for my roofing, but I decided to go ahead and take it up a step and actually make these tin roof pieces for it. And I also tried something different, the windows too this time. I usually don't make them with the window interior. I usually just frame the window out. So making the windows different this time was a little bit more of a challenge, but I feel that's something I've been wanting to do, and I've done it. I'm pretty happy and proud of myself for trying something new and different. And I every so often had to use a special glue just to hold a couple of these down if they were just not bent right, because the white glue wasn't always strong enough to hold everything as I was working. Here I'm putting that brown glaze on all over. I'm just rubbing it in all the cracks, pushing around on everything, and just get it all in there. What I'm going to eventually do is get out my paper towel and blot off all the excess and trying to camouflage all the lines from the brush that may appear and give it a more dull look, take away a lot of that shine that I had. And now I'm using the burnt sienna just on all the edges, all the cracks and creases. I've got both buildings done. I still have a lot more to do. Then I'll come in with a lighter orange and start pressing it into different areas, giving it little rusty spots. I go back and forth between my orange and burnt siennas to get those colors. I've added my bayed trees just to see what they'll look like right there. They look pretty good. I've painted the house with a gray dry brush effect, kind of give it a little bit of a clapboard look to it. I use the toothpicks to position where the trees are going to be, so I can just keep that in there when I add my grass, and it'll be easy to find those holes again. And I'm just using autumn grass and wild meadows mix for around the edges of the property. I'm going to be using a different grass for the yard. I've got my rocks in and everything. And at this point, before I put the grass down, I should have put the resin in my creek, but I'm always jumping around on my steps. I think that's just the way life is, right? So I've got my static grass going on there, and I'll just dump that off. And I'm sprinkling some of that tiny little green fluff called weeds on there. Looks pretty good. Here's the 7mm medium green static grass I'm going to use for the front yard, and I mix that a little bit with some other grasses that I have, but not much, just to add some texture. And I also put a little bunches up here and there just to add some variety and more realism to the piece as I go. So you can see I got all the grass down and everything. I picked out a new car. It's a Mercedes. It's going to work great. I'm just going to have to take that garage door out and put it in there, and I will rust up the front of the car. I've got a tiny axe I made with a toothpick and the aluminum can, and my trees are all wisteria pieces with flowers glued onto them. The flowers from the wisteria that dried up. So I'm stacking my wood right there with my tweezers. Tiny little process. I've worked on the fence and I've got it put down, broken in some areas. I got some of those little wisteria pieces out in the yard. I made a clothesline with some wire and toothpicks. And a lot of the surface I just go through. I glue the tops of everything down, and I sprinkle once again that dark green weeds fine turf that I have from Woodland Scenics. It's nice and small, and it really works well to make everything look mossy. So as I'm going through, I'm putting some on the walls. I tested that out, and later on I put it on all the walls in between where the clapboard siding would be. And still slowly working on the roof. I did add a stove pipe to the top, and I'm adding grass to the edges too of the roof. Just keep adding layers and layers till you feel that it looks good, and tiny little sticks on top of the roof too. So you can see there, I just used those brown paints and oranges to rust out the front of the car, which you can barely see because it's forever trapped into the garage. And I took out that ivy I have and I started putting on the house. And it kind of reminds me of blackberry bushes too. I've put some plexiglass on both sides, and I'm going to go ahead and mix up my two-part resin. And this takes about a total of 5 minutes to do this. Get everything together, get gloves on, have some rubbing alcohol on the side for easy cleanup, and about 3 minutes of actually mixing it, which is so time consuming. You know, you film it all, but you cut out actually how much time it really takes to do it. And I'm also going to pour that right back into the original container of the hardener, and that's a good way, is a two cup method mix. So boring, boring, boring as I mix along. Well, now I'm just going to add a little bit of this soldier blue acrylic paint into my resin, just to add a little bit of color into the tiny creek. I usually paint the bottom of my creeks a dark brown and then add layers of color over it, but this was so tiny I figured I might as well get away with it. I added twice as much paint as I thought I needed, which kind of gave this nice little blue tint to it. And later on, I wished I would have added a little bit of brown to it. But you know, you learn as you go. That's what this is all about. Each little piece is a learning process and learning new steps. So it looks pretty good. I will add some grass and brush around the edges to really pull that in and bring that more realistic. So I've got the ivy around. I've got my little trees. Oh, I've also added my Mod Podge. When the resin dried 24 hours later, I took out my gloss Mod Podge and I just painted it on. And I've already done it, but I'm just showing you here on this little area. And it looks like little ripples of the river. And you can really go with this and add some white paint or other things to make it look like white water if you want. But mine's a lazy going creek here. So just let that dry and start working on the tiny little details of the little plants and start adding them around as I go. Each one of these diecast dioramas has a different story and a different rate of abandonment. And the tow yard, which connects to the front of this, is Vern. And this is Vern's parents' house, Leonard and Babe. And they lived here many years. Probably, I'm going to say they moved in maybe in the 40s, sort of 50s into this house. That's a good little timeline. But they've passed away a couple decades ago, and the house has pretty much been sitting in abandonment like this because Vern actually had a different house, and Vern's recovering from knee surgery. So that's our fun little story. And as I go, I'm just slowly going to learn new techniques. So on this one, I learned the roof technique, and I learned some windows, and I got to work with that ivy some more, which was a lot of fun and a little messy. And also decided that I do need some more plant life, so I'll have to go around my yard and find some more stuff that I can dry out and use. These were my wisteria trees. I thought that was going to work. They were the best thing I had available to me at the time. I've been writing my tips on the edges there, so I remember the grass blends that I use for each one. And I do want to add power lines and power poles, but that will be in the future when I get more of the diorama set made and I can start positioning everything as they need to go. So I've had a lot of fun making this, and I hope you join me for my next video, which should be the abandoned diner. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day.